92% of the people live there. And what is particularly important is because they're considered the water towers of humanity. They also contain the greatest biodiversity. They're a paradise for recreation, and of course they have all kinds of sacred and spiritual values. But there are lots of constraints because mountains are very fragile and hazardous, and whatever we do in the mountains has a huge impact on the lowland, and there are many, many conflicts in mountains. Just to give you an idea how important mountains are, what I'm showing you here is the percent of the river basin which is the percent of the river basin which is in mountains. So if you look at the Orange River, the Colorado River and so on, about 50% of the watershed is in mountains, but it contributes about 90% of all the water. And if you look at even these big river basin, a very large contribution comes from mountain environments. But then we have all these interesting issues that whatever we do in the mountains has a huge impact in the lowland. So that gets me to the hydrological cycle, and you need to understand that very well because this is critical in how we manage water. I divide the cycle into blue water and green water. The blue water is simply the rainfall which hits the surface and goes into rivers, lakes, reservoirs and groundwater. That's the water which we manage. But then there's the green water cycle. That's the rainfall which hits the vegetation, goes into the soil and gets picked up by the vegetation and evapotranspires back into the atmosphere. What is very important is there's only about a third of all the rainfall goes into the blue water and 2/3 go into the green water. And we don't manage the green water very well. If you look at this chart, you can see that 100% of the precipitation hits the soil and the land. 65% goes actually into the green water cycle and evaporates up, and only a third goes into lakes, and this is the stuff which we use. So we need to learn how to manage the green water much better. And this is obviously the most important issue we have to think about when we talk about what happens to the rainfall when it hits the ground in relation to different land uses. So if you look at this part here, the green is the amount of rainfall which evapotranspires, the red is what runs over the surface, the orange is what goes into the soil, and the blue is what goes into groundwater. So if we're in a forest, this is how the water is distributed. But if you then urbanize things and change the land use, you end up in the urban environment where 90% or 80% of all the rainfall ends up as runoff, which we then have lots of flooding issues to deal with. Also, what's very important for you is when we look at if we make the soils and the land in the watershed impervious, we change the hydrology. This is what happens after a rainfall to the river system. If you're in a forest, this is how the river responds after the rainfall. And if you make it impervious, like in an urban environment, then the runoff is much, much different. First of all, it's much higher in peak flow. It comes much faster after the rainfall, and then we have much less in the base flow. And if you then look at imperviousness versus biodiversity, we now know that a lot of biodiversity occurs at very low impervious surfaces. And as you create more impervious surfaces, we don't have very many biodiversity organisms in river systems. So the final thing which you need to know is there is a critical difference between the headwaters and the lowland. And here is the real critical point, because that's where processes change. In the headwaters, everything is linked. So whatever runs off goes directly into the stream. Once you get below that into the lowland, then the processes are very different, because then things are not directly linked to the river. They go into the floodplain and into the buffer zone, and that behaves very differently. So let's now go to the emerging issue in climate. Alan Hamlet from the University of Washington, I worked with him quite a bit, and he did some interesting things. He looked at 12 of the global models predicting what is going to happen to temperature in the Pacific Northwest. And as you can see, we're here right now, and this is going to be 2100, and you can see there's a spread in all the models, but overall they all go in the same direction for temperature. But when you look at the prediction for precipitation, we're in for some real surprises, because some models are telling us it's going to get 25% more moist, and others telling us 20% less. Well, if you go to a politician with this kind of projection, they're going to tell you, well, you better do some more research, we can't make any decisions on that kind of projection. Well, I would argue that we probably won't be able to get very much better prediction on precipitations in mountains, because it is so variable and so dynamic, and you have so many microclimatic conditions. But what we know is the high mountains are actually warming up faster. What I'm showing you here is December, January, February, March, April, May, and this is elevation from nothing to 14,000 feet. And you can see the high elevation in March, April, May seem to be warming up faster. And this is really bad news for mountain watershed management, because that means the snow is going to melt earlier. So I did a bit of an assessment on climate conditions in your part of the world. This is the East Kootenay, that's the West Kootenay. I looked at Golden and Cranbrook and Caslow at Castlegar. And if you look at this, this is the minimum, the extreme minimum, the mean minimum monthly, the mean temperature, the mean maximum, and the maximum temperature. If you look at the January Cranbrook conditions, you can see that the high temperatures haven't really increased very much. But what is happening is the extreme low temperatures have increased dramatically. And if you can go to Golden, it's even more dramatic, and you can see the high temperatures in January haven't changed, but the very low temperatures have increased dramatically by up to 8 and 10 degrees. And what is interesting, we have told the public that the average temperatures are going to increase by 2 degrees, and I would argue that's nonsense. What we should have told the people that the variability is increasing, and it's increasing even more dramatically by showing you this part, which is an overwhelming horrendogram. But anyway, what I'm showing you here is the extreme minimum, the mean temperature, the mean maximum, and the extreme maximum temperature from January to December. And this is in the West Kootenay, that's in the East Kootenay, and this is this north, and this is the south. So if you look at this, you can see that January, the temperatures at the low end have increased dramatically, and in the East Kootenays it has actually even increased more. In Golden it has increased by 7 to 8%, mostly in January and December. This is quite important, because if you then look at this, this would be 8 climate stations in the Columbia basins, and this is the extreme minimum in December and in January, and you can see almost all of them have increased dramatically, whereas the extreme maximum hasn't increased at all. And if you then look at precipitation, the interesting part here is the West Kootenays in blue are getting much more wet, particularly in March, April, May, whereas the East Kootenays not so much. And if you then look at the snowpack over the last 50 years, you can see almost in all these climate stations the snowpack has declined dramatically over the 50-60 year period. So this means we're going to have a tremendous change in the way the rivers respond. Glaciers obviously are shrinking, everybody knows that, and we are still relying on quite a few watersheds for glacial melt, which for the time being is actually quite beneficial, because it will give you summer water, and it will also provide cooler water for during the summer period when it gets very hot. However, this is going to change once your glaciers are very small, and Dan Faugre, who works in Glacier National Park, has given us lots of good ideas on what is going to happen in terms of glaciers. When the park was created in 1900, there were about 125 glaciers in the park, and today there are about 25. So you can see things are changing quite rapidly as far as glaciers are concerned. Now, I was telling you we should pay much more attention to extreme events, and I'll show you a couple of examples of what has happened in mountains in the last few years. This is the record of Kaslo from 1909 all the way to now, and what I'm showing you here is the monthly June precipitation. So all of these are precipitation events per year. And this was the highest we ever had in 1961. Well, in 2006, in 2011, and 2012 or 13, you can see we had events which were far bigger than anything we have ever experienced. And if you look at this in terms of a bell-shaped curve, you can see these extremes are way out of norm. Now, this is not unusual, because if you look at Boulder, Colorado, in 2013 they had one of these incredible events. Again, there's a 100-year record. Everything is down here, and look how much out of norm this September event was. Again, same thing here. Even more dramatically, it's not only the flooding, but it's also the drought. So if you look at what has happened in Texas, this is the amount of the rainfall, and this is increasing temperatures over a 100-year period. These are all the events which have taken place, and this is the 2011 event, and you can see this is totally out of norm. This creates a lot of problems for our communities, because most of our communities depend on the IDF curve, the intensity, duration, frequency curve of rainfall. And typically what we do is we look at storm return periods, and we look at the historic information, and this would be the historic conditions, and then we can say at 100 years this is how much runoff we're going to get in a storm event. However, because of climate changing, this is going to change, but it's also going to change because the land use is changing. And so we're now saying a storm which occurred every 100 years might now occur every 7 or 10 years, which means we're going to have to rethink the way we do stormwater management. So that gets me to the next part, and that's the land use, because it's not just the climate. People focus mainly on what climate change is going to do, but you have to kind of combine that with land use changes. And remember, we do all kinds of things in mountains. We produce hydropower, we intensify agriculture, we have a lot of tourism, we do a lot of forest management, we do some mining, we have fires and disease, all kinds of issues which cause some difficulties. You all know the problems with hydropower projects, you know that better than me. But you probably have never seen this before. This is a new traffic light map sign. What does it tell you? It tells you that in the future, in many parts of the world, hydropower projects operate for peak flow or for peak energy demand. That means they rack up the production when the demand is the highest. And this can create some huge problems downstream if you picnic in the low part of the watershed, and all of a sudden this release of water comes, can create some huge problems. This is just showing you how important that is in Switzerland. The red lines are all the rivers which are influenced by hydropower, but the orange lines are influenced by hydropowers which only produce electricity for peak power production. And this is going to become a much bigger issue around even in the Columbia Basin, because the demand for peak power is going to go up. What we know about hydropower production is we have had all kinds of impacts on the watershed, and these are just a summary of all the impacts we have shown as a result of hydropower production. And the important thing is we're now producing more reservoirs because it's becoming clear that we need to store more water. If you look at California, they're seriously thinking of building new reservoirs, and if before we do that, we need to start looking at our experience and say, what have we actually learned, and what can we do better about it? That gets me to tourism, and I just want you to show the kind of land use changes which occur in intensive tourism. Obviously, skiing creates all kinds of water issues. Hiking creates some pollution and water demand problems. Golfing, mountain biking, swimming, all of these have a tremendous impact on watershed management. Just to give you an idea of what's happening in some parts of the world, this was the traditional village in the mountains, and then recreational people came in, and you see the land use changes which are taking place. This means we're creating massive amounts of impervious surfaces which are going to create a change in the flow of the river. Just to give you an idea how intensive this is, here is Grindelwald and Whistler and Innsbruck and Val d'Isère. The resident population in Grindelwald is about 4,000 people, but they get about 1 million visitors to stay in these mountains, and it's about equal summer and winter. They have 500 kilometers of hiking trails, 160 biking trails, 170 kilometers of ski hills. You can see all of these different resort areas have massive changes taking place in the watersheds. And just to give you an idea now, because of the global warming, they did an assessment on which of the ski hills in Europe are still viable if climate changes. So if you are on the north-facing side, we're saying now the current reliable snow line is at 1,200 meters, and with 1 degree temperature increase, it has to go up about 150 meters. If you're on the north side, then of course this is slightly lower. So if you look at all the resorts in Germany, in Austria, France, Switzerland, and Italy, you can see right now a few of these resorts are no longer viable. If we have a 2 degree increase, some of them have no more possibilities economically to allow skiing. And if this continues, only Italy and Switzerland and part of France in the high mountains will be viable. And this is also going to happen in your part of the watersheds, because you see that already. Some of the places in the Okanagan will not be viable in the next 15 to 20 years because they can't go any higher. They're already high enough. So here's just an idea to show you right now in Europe, in the Alps, they have 660 resort areas which provide skiing opportunities. Now, that was 2010, and now there are only 609 which are viable. And if we have a 4 degree increase, there will only be 200 resorts viable. That gets me to this, and this is what they're advertising now all over Europe. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's snow security for sure. If you can't open the ski resort at Christmas, economically, this is going to be very, very difficult. So now they're telling you that we are making sure that you have snow at Christmas. Well, that means we need to make a lot of snow, and this is quite important for watershed management because it takes huge amount of water to actually produce snow. And they're now building all kinds of reservoirs for snow making. And if you look at this, about 30% of all the water which we use for snow making actually sublimates and evaporates during the process. It also requires a lot of water. Typically, the typical range for making snow is about similar to how much irrigation water we need for a hectare of corn production. It's about 2,000 cubic meters per hectare. This is quite dramatic. And the other problem you need to think about it, this is the water demand at the time when the rivers are fairly low in their discharge. And so if the spring runoff is low and we have a low summer, then this is no longer viable anyway. So that gets me to this horrendogram, which basically is telling you how urban land use is changing the way we manage water. And you can see we do all kinds of crazy things with urbanization. We create stormwater runoff, domestic wastewater, industrial discharge, accidental spills, solid waste, atmospheric inputs, and water supply problems. So the urban part is quite critical, and if these resorts become bigger, this will be a big issue. This is an issue particularly in terms of reservoirs, because most of the communities rely on a reservoir for their drinking water, some rely on groundwater, and some people are now even going to roof water harvesting for their drinking water purposes. Forestry is equally as important, and you can see when we harvest the forest, when we plant trees, when we build roads, and we do long-term management, we have all kinds of impacts on water. Typical forest harvesting, you can see the road network which we built, and the thing you probably don't know is, let me go back 1 second here. Probably the thing you don't know is we have about 250,000 kilometers of paved roads in British Columbia, but we have 500,000 kilometers of logging roads. And remember, when we built the logging roads, we don't build them the same way as we built the paved roads, and we don't maintain them the same way. This is just showing you an interesting kind of study was done a few years ago by Dan Moore, where he took one watershed adjacent to another watershed. This one was logged by 40% and this one was not. And what he did, he looked at what happens before they logged, during they logged, and after, and compared how these two rivers behaved. So if you look at this, before they logged, the two rivers behaved pretty much the same. And then they logged it, and you can see that one which was logged created quite a different hydrological regime. And it took about 10 years before it got back to norm. So when we do very large logging efforts, we change the hydrology quite dramatically. And here's the example of some of these logging roads which we build fast and don't maintain them, and this creates huge amounts of sediments, which is a real problem for watershed management. Forest fires are also creating some real issues, and if this snowpack is going to stay low as it is, we are expecting far more problems with forest fires every summer. And not only does it create hydrophobicity on the soil, which repels the water, that means it creates less infiltration, you're going to get more runoff, and it's going to increase stream flow shortly after the events take place. And if you look at what has happened over the years, this is what happened in the US and this is what happened in Canada. The number of fires have not really increased. You can see, you can't really tell that the number of fires have increased. But what has increased is the area which has been burned. And this is true in both cases. And if you look at this in here, the average area of fire has increased dramatically in both Canada and in the US. And this is mainly due to higher summer temperatures, reduced snowpack, less snow water in the snow, increased forest infestation, stressed trees, and poor forest management, because we need to start thinking about looking at fuel load reduction and try to plant more diverse tree covers. Of course, you know all the problems with the pine beetle infestation, where we had no much choice than logging most of these areas, and these areas now create some concern about how this is going to change some of the flow in the rivers. Mining is of course equally as an important issue, and these are the different types of mines, and this is how they influence the water quality and the water quantity. And as you know, with some of the inadequate tailing ponds which we have, we need to be concerned about what this is going to do. Just to give you a few examples, one of the biggest problems in mining is acid mine drainage. These are mostly the kind of mines which are copper and lead and zinc mines which are in the sulfide form, and once they're exposed to the air they oxidize and create all kinds of acid mine drainage. But probably a bigger problem in mining is the sediments, which create all kinds of problems. You can see some of these events are quite dramatic. if we get these incredible storm events, we're going to create all kinds of landslides. But you have to think about this. This is a landslide which has occurred strictly by climate, and this has a landslide occurred strictly by climate and land use, because they built this logging road in a very difficult area, and then we had a big event, and then you get all these wonderful things happening. This is actually an event which happened between Lake Louise and Golden, and I was fortunate to be right in it, and everybody was ticked off because they had to go all the way through Radium Hot Springs in order to get back to Vancouver, and I spent the next 2 days just watching what happened, and it was quite an event. Water pollution is going to be a big issue, and we're going to have to make sure we can actually deal with this. So now that I have depressed you with all the problems, let's see what we can actually do about it. So we need to start thinking about domestic water conservation. We need to talk about riparian buffer zones, creating natural channels, improving flood controls, urban stormwater management, and create more biodiversity in both agriculture and forestry. Just to give you an idea what's going to happen with water conservation, this is on the Sunshine Coast here, and these are the summer temperatures over the last from 1960 to now. You can see July, August, September, and October, all the total precipitation has declined quite dramatically. At the same time, this is the maximum, the mean, and the minimum temperature. You can see during the summer, all of these temperatures have increased. So we have less precipitation and more temperature increases. And this created already some concerns last year. This is the reservoir which supplies all the water to 60% of the Sunshine Coast. That's in August, but there's still a bit of snow. This is in September, and this is in October. And this is not necessarily an exception, because this year it could be even worse. If you then look at degree temperatures from low to the air temperatures, you can see that consumption during the winter is pretty steady. We use about the same amount of water during the winter time when the temperatures are cold, but as soon as the temperatures go up, you can see how the demand for water goes up. And this, so typically it's about 480 liters in the Sunshine Coast, 600 during the transition zone, and goes up to 900 in the very high temperature period. Does this work in the Columbia Basin? In 1988, we had a student go around all the community to find out how much water they use. And it was quite fascinating, because nobody really had a good accounting. So these are all basic estimates. They're probably not very accurate. But what is interesting is, look at the amount of water per person which is used in many of your communities, way over 1,000 liters, cubic meters per person per day. This is massive. And if you look at the worst case scenario, this is the average in the US. The average in the US is about 600 liters. The average in Canada about 340. And most of your communities are above the 1,000 cubic meter per liter per person per day values. The other thing which is interesting, you pay very, very little for water. This is the dollars per cubic meter, which is 1,000 liters, and you can see some people pay about 19 cents for 1,000 liters, and in the worst case, it's about $1.02. If you look at Canadian cities, they're all around $1 per cubic meter. Vancouver's about 63 cents. And if you look at Europe, they're between $2 and $7. So if we don't charge for the water, we don't have money to help improve the reservoirs and the storage capacity and so on. And we now know that the dollars you pay per cubic meter, as it increases, you reduce the amount of water you use. So if you don't pay very much, you use a lot. And if you pay a lot, you don't use as much. That's a very simplified picture, but this is the Columbia Basin communities. So then I started to look at, Meredith gave me access to her wonderful data set, and I thought it would be interesting for you to see that. This is 6 years. Each year This is from 2009 to 2014. And this is one community. We don't want to embarrass the community. This is one community has done nothing. You can see almost every year there's the same amount of consumption. It's monthly water use. And here's a community which actually has done something quite dramatic in 2014. That's the red part. You can see they have been able to reduce their consumption dramatically for the whole year, not just in the summer, but also the rest of the year. And if you want to look at it, this one, this is the delinquent community who has done nothing. All of this is the 5 to 6 years, and the red is the 2014, so it's pretty much the same, related to temperatures and the amount of water used. And this is the community has done quite a good effort in trying to reduce not only their consumption during the winter, but also significantly reduce their consumption in the summer. So you can see this is a massive decline in the amount of water they're using. And if you want to look at this, the one community has done a good effort. They were able to reduce their consumption by 37% annually, whereas the other one hasn't done anything. So we need to start really pushing all these communities to actually start massive conservation efforts. The next thing which is important for you is we need to really look at riparian buffers. Science is telling us that we need far bigger riparian buffers around the river than the 30 meters which the regulations now tell us. Because if we want all these functions, from water temperature moderation to nutrient uptake, sediment control, pollution reduction, and species diversity, we need somewhere between 60 to 100 meters of buffer zones. And this is something most of your conservation people can actually do, because that helps you also with stormwater management. And the reason why we say you need 3 different zones is the first zone is really where the river, the runoff, the rainwater runoff goes directly in the stream. But then you have also the subsurface flow in the soil that creates the second zone. And then there's the third zone is where the groundwater actually comes in. That's why we need a much bigger buffer zone. Now typically what we have done is we channelized most of the rivers. And you know, first we built a protection wall here. And then it flooded, so we built another one, and then it flooded again. And then they built it higher. Now you have to ask yourself, well, do I want to build the Berlin Wall, or what am I going to do? So what we're saying is if you channelize your river, only these 3 functions can take place in the river. If you make it natural, there are all these other functions like natural inflow from drainage, natural outflow from drainage. You can have all these wonderful processes taking place, and this helps you dramatically for storm management. So we're now recreating natural channels. This is in the Okanagan. You can see it was all diked, and now we're removing these dikes and we're recreating these natural channels, so we have oxbow lakes and meanders. This is far better not only for biodiversity and aquatic life, but it also helps you tremendously with storms. They're doing this all over the world now. They're trying to get away from channelizing rivers, but if your land is very expensive, you can buy a bit of land and you can create some biodiversity, but one place alone is not sufficient. So the thing I should mention is, let's not channelize, because trying to rehabilitate channels is much, much more difficult. We need to start mapping the flood hazard zones far more carefully than we have, and this has not been done much in the Columbia Basin. But what the new approach is to flood management is no longer to build all these dikes and structures to protect yourself, but we now need to have some design floods. And this means what we're doing is we're going to designate certain areas which we deliberately flood for temporary storage of water. This was done in the Mississippi quite successfully in 2012, where there was a big flood coming, and they were going to protect all the cities below, so they breached the dike here. They inundated all this agricultural land and stored the water temporarily for about 2 weeks, and then released it later on. and this was actually very successful in reducing the peak flow, and the farmers were back in business in about 4 to 5 months, and they were compensated for it, and that seems to be the new norm. So you need to think about your communities wherever you have a topographic depressional area. Could that be used for temporary storage? It can be a park, it can be an agricultural field, or it can be a golf course. Your golf players will not like me for suggesting that. But these are now things which we need to consider, because we're getting bigger peak flow storm events, and most of the structures we have are no longer adequate, and the question is, can we build more structures? That gets me to stormwater management and what to do. We now need the property owners to start thinking about how to retain the rainfall on site. The neighborhood has to look at very different ways of storing and delaying the runoff, and at the watershed scales we have to really start thinking about bigger buffer zones and zoning and flood controls. So these are all the things you can do at the property scale. You can start thinking about green roofs, roof water harvesting and reuse, minimizing impervious surfaces, pervious pavement, putting topsoil on your lawn before you put the grass on so that it can absorb a lot of the water. That's green water management. Encourage trees on your property because they help with the stormwater management, and create rain gardens. And then at the neighborhood scale we need smaller roads, no curbs, no gutter, infiltration systems, wetlands and ponds. And at the watershed scales we need large buffers, diverse channels, and wetlands and zoning controls and innovative flood management. I'm going to go very quickly through some examples so I can show you that this is actually happening. A lot of people now are going to roof water harvesting, because in Vancouver 40% of all the drinking water is used for outdoor gardening, and this can be actually minimized by storage of roof water. We like to have all the driveways paved, but what we could be doing is something like this, because your engine is parked here and all the crud goes into the soil and the organisms can break down a lot of the contamination. Roads, we can build these roads with no curbs, no gutters, no pipes to go into streams, have infiltration systems so all the water and the pollution gets infiltrated and cleaned up to some extent. Here's a good example where they made actually a much nicer kind of stormwater system, where you don't need grass, you don't need to cut it, and you got trees and you don't need to water it because all the infiltration takes care of most of the things. This is how we actually do it. We do compartments. We fill it with sand and gravel, and that's what it looks afterwards. We now look at parking lots, and we say parking lots should actually infiltrate all the crud before it's released into the rivers, and this can be very effective by this type of thing or this type of thing. Wetlands, we're now building wetlands all over the place, and this is a very excellent way of detaining water and also improving the water quality. We built this in the middle of the city now, and we have some really successful research to show that many of the pollutants can be reduced dramatically if we filter all the runoff into wetlands. There has been a big issue about mosquitoes, but we now know that we can prevent the expansion of mosquitoes by doing 6 different things. First of all, make sure that your water is never stagnant. Make sure it never gets eutrophic. So some people put a solar panel in there to make sure the water moves at all times. Create a high diversity of plants, a biodiverse plant. Make sure that the plants are spaced so the UV light penetrates the water between. We introduce stickleback fish, which can tolerate relatively contaminated conditions, and sometimes we might need to go in there at the larvae stage and do some biological controls. So enhancement in forestry should be focusing on more biodiversity. We should be creating many different trees which we replant to create much more resilient system. We have the plant varieties have a much better chance to survive on the climatic conditions. And this is also true for biodiversity in agriculture, because if we build hedgerows between the fields on sloping land, we can reduce erosion. If we plant leguminous trees in between, they can fix nitrogen and increase the soil fertility. If we build trees, they can absorb moisture and nutrients from a different part of the soil depth, so they don't influence the agricultural crops, and they also, of course, recycle carbon, which would be a positive thing. So, what is the impact of the combined effect of land use change and climate change? And how do we translate this into changes in the streamflow regime and the water quantity dynamics? Those are the big issues which you have to address. And I think we have lots of opportunities now to do that, because at least the public is becoming aware that these things are important. If you're interested, we just did a video which is publicly available on all the innovations in stormwater management which is happening in the Vancouver area, and you can click on each one and it tells you who is doing anything innovative and how successful it has been. So hopefully that was of some interest to you, and I'll be happy to answer the questions if you have any. Anybody still there?
Just needed to unmute myself, Hans. Hi, thank you very much. What I've been doing is watching the questions and the chat box. So I want to start out with one of the questions that one of the listeners had, which is back to the water consumption reduction, the domestic water figures you were showing, the good community and the bad community. What were some of the changes that the community made that was able to reduce their water consumption?
Well, it's very, very difficult to persuade people to go on water conservation when the perception is we don't have any water problems. This is particularly the case in British Columbia. And so there is no easy way of doing this. Some people said metering, some people said roof water harvesting, some people said we need policy, some people said we need pricing. There is no one way of actually doing this. The best way, and this is what's going to be interesting to see in the Columbia Basin, every community is doing something slightly different, and each one has different success. So you have to kind of adjust this to the conditions, but the one thing we really need to start thinking about is we need to start metering, because how do we account for the water when we don't really know? We just guess. It's very interesting. We can't really tell you how much leakage is taking place unless we actually measure it, right? So I hope that answered that question a bit.
One question that I, sorry, I'm trying to read and think at the same time, and that's very difficult. In terms of those changes that communities are making, one of the tensions that seems to me is between different objectives, between, for example, having more people grow food in the urban environment versus trying to reduce water. So you have, I'm just wondering about with things like water pricing and water metering and per household consumption of water, it seems like gardening and those kinds of efforts might be discouraged by that.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting phenomenon now. You know, in Vancouver now, the big deal is grow food locally. But all of them in the city are using domestic water to do that. And this is domestic water which is very expensive because it has been treated, it has no bacteria in it, and no nutrients in it. So this is pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. So what we need to start thinking about is, can't we actually store water and use it for outdoor purposes? And roof water harvesting is a very effective way of doing this, and it's not really that expensive. I do it in my house, and I never use domestic water, and it's usually sufficient because I get enough rain during the summer. The cost of it is not really that high, and depending on, of course, how much food you want to grow. If you want to do it commercially, then that's probably not an effective way to do it. The water pricing really is a difficult one because everybody is saying, well, that's unfair to the poor people. But I would argue if we do it in a block case where, for example, in South Africa, the first 25 liters per person per day is free. And then as you use more, your price goes up. And that's the best strategy to actually discourage people from using a lot of water, which is expensive to treat. So those would be the kind of issues I would think about growing local food. We can do most of it by roof water harvesting.
Okay. The other one in terms of land use, actually the questioner that asked about the communities wanted to know what specifically did Community C do to reduce that water use? What did they do?
Well, I think the very first thing is we need a massive public education to tell people, look, you get this, the communities try very hard to provide you with a good supply of water. And so get that idea across. And then the next idea is definitely we need to start accounting for the water. And just to give you an idea, one of my former PhD students, he's a hydrologist, he got hired by Deloitte, an accounting company. And his mandate was water accounting for business. And he has now worked with them for the last 6 years. And I talked to him the other day and asked him, how is it going? And he said, well, I'm spending 80% of my time on carbon accounting and only 20% on water accounting, because for business, the water is cheap, energy is expensive, so they worry about what is expensive, they don't worry about cheap. And so we need to kind of change that cultural thinking that water is important and it's very inelastic. As long as you have it, nobody worries. But when you don't have it, it's a crisis. So if we can get that idea across and then be proactive, then I think we can actually solve our problem dramatically. And remember, in the Columbia Basin, the forecast is that you're not going to get a lot more drier. You're going to get slightly more wet. And that means if you actually manage your water better, then you can actually you can overcome the summer drought far better. So we need to start thinking about better storage, better distribution systems. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the municipalities in your part of the world is leakages, because all your pipes are old and corroded. Many of the communities, one of the communities losing 60% of all their drinking water by leakages. And that's an expensive proposition, but this has to be done. So the infrastructure problem is probably the biggest challenge we're facing.
Well, thank you. I've got another question from someone in the group here that I had missed initially, which is about the BC government's recent approval of groundwater extraction, and it was specific to Anarchist Mountain. So let's see if I can read it here. Well, I'm not sure if it's really a question. Maybe could you comment on the BC government's approval of the increases in groundwater extraction for water bottling?
Well, the big challenge we face is the government is timid. They don't want to address groundwater regulations. They're going to do a kind of a compromise. Here was, the Water Act was created in the early 1900s and never changed until now. And now is an opportunity to actually change the act, but they're too timid because they're worried about all the landowners, because we have this stupid first in time, first in right legislation. That means whoever had the first license has priority over everybody else. And so they are worried that politically this might have a big backlash if they start controlling it and saying we're going to charge people and regulate the amount of water they can use. But sooner or later we're going to have to address this. So they're going to set priority areas like in the Okanagan where things are pretty desperate. So they're going to initiate it there, and I think they're going to make it semi-mandatory, but not in the other areas. And they're going to also make it somewhat mandatory for industry, but private owners are going to be exempted. And sooner or later, I mean, if everybody goes into groundwater, you're going to have a problem. California is facing this right now. They had no groundwater regulation. They're now in the third year of a drought, and now they're trying to initiate groundwater legislation. This is actually almost too late, because if you initiate legislation, it's going to take several years before that's implemented. So I think we politically should be much more forceful in saying we need some control of accounting, not only for licenses for surface water, but also for licenses of groundwater, because it's going to become more and more of an issue. You can tell I'm politically not correct.
Well, one of the other issues around the area, one of our member groups monitors a stream, and there's a hydro project, one of those ones that diverts part of the stream through a pipe fall. So it's a waterfall, and you divert part of the stream through a pipe fall for microhydro. And so you've got on the one hand, the microhydro, producing carbon-free energy, and on the other hand, the aesthetic, recreational, biological values, we're going to have to come up with some way of addressing those kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, we should actually not only think of water, but we should think of energy at the same time as water. I think one of the biggest challenges we face, and here I'm politically incorrect as well, do you want 1,000 run-of-the-river hydro projects all over the British Columbia, or do you want Site C? This is the big dilemma. And neither one is good, but if you look at how much disturbance you would make by having 1,000 run-of-the-river hydro, you would be destroying a lot of the natural habitat all over the province. And so I would say, if you have if you have no choice and you need more energy, which we do, then Site C is probably the best option, because it's already screwed up, and the impact of Site C beyond what is already impacted is relatively minor. I talked to Mike Church, and he did a long study on the system, and he said it's not going to change very much as a result of it. So in my view, again, this is obviously politically controversial, I would say we would be far better off having one system rather than destroying many undisturbed areas, because then you will have, it's not the run-of-the-river system itself, but it's the access roads and the transmission lines and all that kind of stuff, which probably has a much bigger impact on watersheds than having Site C. I know many of you probably don't like this idea.
Well, we still have most of our participants. Can I ask you one final question? I think that's all I've got in terms of questions from the participants. One participant would just like to know, how much do we really know about groundwater in the province?
About what?
Groundwater. And I think probably supply, flow. Do we have good information about groundwater?
Well, the ministry has been mapping quite a bit of the groundwater aquifers, but not really in your part of the world, because they primarily do this either for mining or they do it in the populated areas. And so we're still a long way off before we have a really good inventory of groundwater. The main problem we have with groundwater, we might know where the aquifers are, but we don't know the recharge of the aquifer, because every aquifer is different and most of the groundwater is very old. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4 years. It's 10 to 100 years old, which means if we pump it out faster than it's recharged, then we're going to drop the water table over time. And this is the biggest challenge. We probably know pretty well where some of these aquifers are, but we don't know how sustainable they are. And this is where we really need to push research and the government to do far more in order to protect ourselves, because the demand on groundwater is going to go up tremendously. I was just reading an article about China. Everybody now is going on groundwater because they don't have any surface water, which is so polluted that they can't use it. And now the same problem is going to happen. California now is in the same situation. So I think we should be proactive and start thinking about this before we have a crisis.
Yeah. Well, I would just on behalf of everyone who was able to tune in today, I would like to really thank you for this presentation. And just to let everyone know that it is recorded, and I'll have it up on the Columbia Basin Network website, and I'll announce it on Facebook. And I'll see if I can get Dr. Schreier to send me a copy of his PowerPoint presentation. We'll see.
Sure.
We'll negotiate that. Is that okay with you?
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh sure. And I'm absolutely. I'll also be putting the website for that video. I'll be putting that up on our Facebook, and I'll try to get that up on the website too. That looks really interesting. So.
Good. Well, I hope it was useful.
Well, thank you very much. Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.